Welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. We work to free hostages and the unjustly detained around the world. Together with their families, we share their stories and let you know how you can help bring them home.
Now, when it comes to using the family for Russia to get what they want, if that's the case, they've picked the wrong family, because I'm not going to carry water for the Russian authorities.
These are some of the most courageous and resilient people among us.
I never thought that my mother, Nahi Tagavi, will ever have a link to negotiations in Vienna about the JCPOA. That's so crazy.
People who have never given up hope.
Trevor told his girlfriend to tell me to be strong. So I'm trying to be strong for Trevor.
You know, if Trevor can cope with what he's dealing with,
exactly,
we can sure cope with the stress.
People who will never stop working to reunite their families.
We'd like to meet with the president. We believe that, he's surrounded by lots of experienced and educated advisors, but I don't believe that any of them have ever had a child taken hostage by a foreign country, especially not a superpower like Russia.
And we'll be right there by their side until their loved one comes back home.
Because if enough people care, then the right people will care enough.
I'm Darren Nair, and I've been campaigning with many of these families for years. When I first started campaigning with these families, I noticed they struggled to get the media attention they needed. So I decided to create this podcast, which is a safe space for the families to speak as long as they need to about their loved ones and what needs to be done to bring them home.
Nobody can prepare you for what our family is going through. Even if someone had told me 1 year before, in 1 year this is going to happen, prepare yourself. That's impossible.
Thank you for listening, and welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. Welcome to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. China is notorious for wrongfully detaining foreign nationals to gain bargaining leverage over foreign governments. This is state-sponsored hostage-taking, also known as hostage diplomacy. The current US State Department's travel advisory for China has a Level 3 reconsider travel rating and includes the following warning to Americans planning on traveling to China. Exercise increased caution in the People's Republic of China due to wrongful detentions. American citizen Kai Li, who is a businessman from New York, has been wrongfully imprisoned in China since September 2016. The US State Department has designated Kai Li as wrongfully detained, and his case has been taken up by the US Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has called for his immediate release. We've had the honor of interviewing Kai's son Harrison Lee twice on our podcast. If you haven't already, please do check out these episodes wherever you get your podcasts or visit podhostagediplomacy.com. We always tell the families we interview that we'll be campaigning right by their side until their loved ones come home, and we mean it. So we'll keep you up to date with their campaigns through SITREP pods like this one or breaking news pods. We're joined today once again by Harrison Lee. Harrison, it's been 9 months since we last spoke to you, and we're sorry that your father is still being wrongfully detained in China. We're also so sorry to hear that your paternal grandfather passed away a few days ago. Please accept our condolences. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me once again, Darren. It's a pleasure as always.
For our listeners who aren't aware of your father's case, can you please give them a summary of what happened?
So my father is Kai Li. He's an American. He's one of 3 Americans who are being wrongfully detained by the Chinese government, according to the U.S. State Department's designation under the Levinson Act, the other 2 being Mark Swadan and David Lin. In 2016, my dad went to China on the 1-year anniversary of his mother's passing to spend some more time with his family. But before he could even get off the plane, agents from China's Ministry of State Security took him away and held him for 10 weeks at an undesignated location where they harshly interrogated him every day. And later it became apparent that they were intent on accusing my dad on false charges of espionage and stealing, quote unquote, state secrets, which our attorney has verified can be freely found even on the internet in China. Unfortunately, that does not stop the Chinese government from saying that the information that my father is alleged to have had is a state secret. And, we've seen repeatedly that the Chinese government uses these very similar espionage and endangering national security kinds of charges in order to arbitrarily detain foreigners. Some of the most high-profile cases in recent years, of course, include the Canadians Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, who were taken apparently in retaliation for the USA's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of the telecommunications company Huawei. And it should be noted that, the two Michaels were given essentially the same charges as my dad. It's a tried and true playbook. But unfortunately, while they have been able to come home, my dad continues to suffer in prison and has for almost 6.5 years now.
Again, we're so sorry to hear that. As I mentioned earlier, we last spoke 9 months ago in April last year. Can you please give us an update on what has happened with regards to your father's case since then? Because I know there's been a lot going on in China with regards to COVID-19 and lockdowns and protests from citizens. So what's happened since we last spoke?
Yeah, so in terms of the COVID-19 situation, obviously that's been fluid, but of course, ticked up very recently in the past month or two. For several weeks in December and the first part of this month, my dad said he was confined 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to his cell. The prisoners weren't even allowed to take showers. They would just take a big bucket of water and deliver it in there for all the prisoners in the cell to use. So that was for several weeks. Of course, my dad said, that was not as bad as, previously when he had actually been under similar situations for a couple months at the beginning of the pandemic. It's really an extremely challenging time in China, of course, with, the COVID-19 surge. Unfortunately, my father learned last Friday that his own dad was one of the victims of the latest COVID-19 surge. It was actually the first day he had been able to leave his cell and go to his position, his work at the library, the prison library. But before he was there for 2 hours, prison guards just came up to him and delivered him the bad news. It was really sudden for our entire family. We had no warning or advance indication that, my grandfather was imminently, going to pass away. But it happened. And I think, the only message, that my dad had and that our family has is that, look, it's been 6.5 years. The last 6.5 years, my dad hasn't been able to spend any time, with his family. He visited China initially in 2016 to commemorate his mother, who had passed away a year prior. But instead of being able to do that, he actually would never be able to see his other parent again. I think this really underscores the passage of time for this case and just how long it's gone on. All we can hope is that, in my grandfather's memory, this spurs greater action and interest in the case to get my dad out before something else bad happens to him, another member of his family. We would just urge our own government to increase the pressure on the Chinese government to get my dad out, because it just doesn't seem like that level of pressure has been applied in our case. Now, in terms of the actual case, there have been very few developments, on my dad's case or the other cases in China, to the best of my knowledge. However, of course, we have seen, in the last 9 months, over a dozen Americans wrongfully detained have come home from around the world. Most recently, of course, Brittany Griner, the celebrated basketball star who came home from Russia. And I think, that gives our family a renewed sense of hope that our own government, at least, is paying attention to this issue of wrongful detention and hostage diplomacy, and that they are willing and able to take the steps necessary to correct these situations. However, we're concerned that we just haven't seen this kind of action from China. And of course, we're told by various folks that China is different, China is difficult. And, we don't doubt that. We know it's hard. And we see many folks in our own government who fight every day for my dad and the other Americans wrongfully detained in China. But it's hard to know because, we've heard a lot of those kinds of things in the past that turned out to be really just excuses for inaction from the government, our own government. And, we saw, last year, of course, at the end of 2021, the U.S. played an instrumental role in securing the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. They've been able to get a couple Americans under exit bans in China home. And so, if those are things that they're able to do, then, it shows that it's not impossible. And our government just needs to act, and iterate more quickly in order to get to a solution.
As I said before, we're so sorry about your grandfather's passing. And just before we go, I asked you more on how your father's doing right now and how he's been dealing with that news. You mentioned that the U.S. helped secure the release of a few Americans who were held in China as a result of exit bans in late 2021. So I read a long article by the Wall Street Journal where they talk about how the two Michaels were released. And your father's mentioned in this article. It says that the US government did try to get your father out as well, but apparently that didn't work out. Do you know any more information about this, or is it something you can share?
Yeah, I mean, look, when that article came out, I learned a ton from that article that nobody, had ever told me privately, and of course, the folks in our government always tell us, they're going to be as transparent as us as they possibly can. But, clearly there are other people that are privy to much more information that they're willing to tell the reporters, but not share with their family, maybe, out of fear that our family is going to react negatively and cast a negative spotlight on our government, which, it sounds perverse, but, we've just seen, lots of evidence of that. I would say one example of that was, this past June, our family finally got a call with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. That was after many, many months of asking. He had done a big group call of a large group of American hostage families in December 2021, and then we'd all requested for follow-up individual calls, which he promised himself on the calls. But the only reason we got that call in June is because another family wrongfully detained in China had a health emergency. And that's really what what spurred the action. Once that health emergency was made known, then that family got a call from Jake within a couple of days, and then they scheduled a call with our family the week or two after. So I think that just illustrates to us that our government is fundamentally being very reactive on these cases. They're not being proactive and actually taking steps to resolve. Now, going back to that article on the two Michaels, and I didn't know my dad was mentioned at the time. I mean, nobody ever told me that this even came up. So I learned about that at the same time as you did. All I know is that those the efforts that whatever efforts were put certainly were not successful, or not even close to successful. I know that the American government, both, at the end of the Trump administration and the beginning of the Biden administration, brought up my dad's name, in these kinds of talks, but it seems like it was never seriously under consideration.
Now, going back to your grandfather and your dad, was your grandfather ever able to visit your dad in prison?
No, not at all. The only contact they had, of course, my dad has 2 to 3 7.5-minute voice calls with the outside world. He typically used one of those per month to call his family in China, which would be his own dad and perhaps his brother who live in China. But other than that, there was one time when the Chinese authorities granted a special exception to allow a single video call. So one of those audio calls became a video call. This was several years ago, but other than that, there's been nobody else has been able to, see my dad or anything like that.
So how's your dad doing right now, and how's his health? Because I know the last time we spoke, you mentioned that he had a stroke before. So how's he doing right now?
Yeah, so, to be honest with you, Darren, I don't know, because since my grandfather passed, all we got that day was a rushed 7.5-minute call, on these monitored lines. And that's all the information we have, right, from my dad. There's no other way to get anything else. Yeah, you could write a letter, but the last time we did a letter, the Ambassador Burns sent a letter to my dad, and even that letter from the ambassador took a month to get to my dad. It was a birthday letter, which was supposed to be for November 9th, my dad's birthday, and then he got it in early December. So there's really no good way to know how he's doing. And, of course, as I mentioned before, these audio calls, they're tightly monitored by the authorities. All I know from that 7.5-minute call was, my dad, he said his health, feels a bit more stable now. But yes, he did suffer a stroke suddenly in November of 2020. He's still taking medication as a result of the fallout from that. Of course, we asked him about the COVID-19 situation, because that's really spreading like wildfire, all over China. And he said, yeah, there are definitely, positive cases, in the prison. He didn't offer any more, detail than that. And he said, he personally wasn't too worried, but of course, the news of his father's passing, of course, is, from COVID is not encouraging. And, especially, of course, prison populations are extremely vulnerable to the spread of COVID. My dad previously was in a cell with 10 others. Now it's been reduced to 5 or 6. But still, of course, those are close quarters where COVID will inevitably spread rapidly. And, it'd be nice if the Chinese government, would take that into account and, at least temporarily, allow the prisoners to be released like Iran did at the beginning of the pandemic. But, the Chinese government is denying that there is even a COVID-19 crisis. So the chances of that we see as being quite slim.
I know you mentioned in previous conversations that we've had that the U.S. Embassy has not, people from the U.S. Embassy in China have not been able to visit your father. And all they could do was have calls with your dad. So is that still the case? Has Ambassador Burns been able to visit your dad, or has anyone else from the embassy been able to visit him? And if not, how frequently do they call him?
Yeah, so no, that situation has not changed. There have been no in-person visits, not even video calls from anyone with my dad, since we last spoke. There's been no in-person consular visit in more than 3 years now. And the consular phone calls that have replaced them. So they used to be in-person 30-minute visits. Now they're just 7.5-minute audio calls on that same monitored system that my dad uses to call home. But yeah, that happens once a month, as afforded for by the Vienna Convention. Ambassador Burns has been able to do 2 of those calls himself, but otherwise has not had any access to my dad.
So it's good to know that Ambassador Burns himself has spoken to your dad. On the last episode of Port Hostage Diplomacy, I spoke to Peter Humphrey, who is a British citizen, a former fraud investigator and former journalist. He and his American wife were both wrongfully imprisoned in China for almost 2 years. Peter now mentors families with loved ones wrongfully imprisoned in China. He helped you as well. He mentioned that the consular visits he received from the British Embassy and his wife received from the American Embassy during their time in prison were more like a messenger and nanny service. That means they would ask him how he was doing and they would pass on and receive messages. That's pretty much all they did. He also said these individuals sent by the UK and US embassies were quite junior and didn't really know much about China. You just mentioned that your dad has been able to speak to Ambassador Burns himself, who has a decent amount of experience. But what has the experience been like for your father and your family?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, by and large, Peter and his wife were held in the exact same prison where my dad is. And Yeah, certainly. I mean, the role of consular affairs, as any employee there will giddily remind you, is solely to focus on, safety and well-being of the American citizens being wrongfully held. So they do not, advocate for their release, even though my dad is considered wrongful. That's just not the purview of the consulate, or American Citizen Services, which is the division within consular affairs that handles the visits to my dad. So yeah, I think a nanny service is quite accurate. I mean, it's sort of just a way for us to pass messages to my dad and make sure that he gets them, because of course we have the calls. But other than that, if we write letters, they're not going to go through. There's a good chance they'll just get lost, and at best they'll be delayed for a long time. So yeah, it's really just a good way to pass messages, and a place for my dad to say any concerns he has about his health or anything like that. But even that is not very effective. Like when my dad suffered from the stroke, the consulate didn't get notified. We only found out after my dad missed his scheduled call with us the normal time, and then we had to do some digging and call the consulate ourselves on a weekend on the emergency number and to try to find out what happened. And, we didn't get the medical reports until a few weeks after. So yeah, even in that singular role, it's not always that effective. As to Ambassador Burns, of course, we're super glad. And my dad is, of course, super glad, that he was able to do, two of the recent calls. It took a lot of work, of course, on elevating this case and time, to get to the level where, the ambassador of the United States to China will finally, pay attention and do this kind of a thing. We're very grateful that he did that, and he said he wanted to do another call with my dad later this month. So we hope that that'll still happen. But yeah, but that's the experience of consular services, and to be honest, my dad is in Shanghai, which is of course a very cosmopolitan city. My understanding is that in other parts of China, the situation is even worse. So, it's really, it's really a dreadful situation all around.
So why is it the U.S. ambassador for China has now started calling your dad after over 6 years? So you said you've done a lot of work. Is this because your campaign is a lot more public than it was previously? Why has it taken so long to get this level of attention? Yeah,
that's a great question. Of course, I don't know the exact answer to that, but look, for the first 2.5 years, our family was completely quiet, right? There was no articles out there about my dad because, the government had convinced us that, hey, being quiet would be the best way to resolve this, right? And making noise would just not be productive, and so on and so forth. But then, of course, after 2.5 years, and, my father had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for something he didn't do, we realized, okay, wait a minute, that didn't work, right? And then we knew that, the only reference case we had at the time was that of Sandy Fangillis, who came home after about 2.5 years. But, her husband ran a really public, really active, and really targeted campaign, and that seemed to work. So then, that made us think, well, geez, we're probably not doing the right thing. Now, so, we went public in early 2019, and then that's when we also submitted the application to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. But, of course, even that in itself, didn't get the same attention. We'd met with Ambassador Terry Branstad at the time, in person, and, he was very nice, but there was just no way to follow up. We would ask for follow up through our channels and just never got it. Even with Ambassador Burns, after he took office, we were not able to make contact with his office. We tried everything we could, of course, through the consulate, but also through our contacts in the State Department over in D.C. And, it didn't work until one day, I think it flipped a switch that it finally got to Ambassador Burns himself. He finally got the memo and heard about it. And then, it's like a flip switch. I think once he personally knew about these cases, he clearly wanted to invest himself in these cases. And then, we've been able to have, direct email contact and things like that since then. So, as to why it took so long, I think a big part of it is just, navigating the bureaucracy to even get the attention of the ambassador. It's not the full story because, of course, we met with Terry Branstad, but, he just was never able to find a way to follow up. And I think maybe, we've also learned in these last 6 years, how to advocate more effectively. And that means, when meeting somebody, or, we have to ask for specific direct contact information, right? And tricks like that, really are important, and follow up and things like that, and being regular about it, and being creative, leveraging your contacts and your network of contacts that's just growing and growing and growing. That's what you have to do.
Well, that's good advice, especially for other families in the same position as yours. So how have you and your family been coping? You're doing your PhD at the moment. Are your professors understanding of your situation when it comes to workloads and assignment deadlines, etc.? I'm not saying you're the type of person that's going to use this as an excuse, but I'm saying, how are you coping, running a campaign, running the Free Kylie campaign, and your daily commitments?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Certainly, I will say, of course, the PhD is a challenge and takes a lot of time, but, I think the big advantage is that it's quite flexible, compared to an ordinary day job. And that, that's been really helpful because, it lets me take calls during the day and things like that. And, that's not something I was able to do when I was working full time. So, look, it's challenging, but, I just think of, how much worse it is for my dad. And I think, well, this is, not so bad. And, we I just gotta, do what I can. My dad, always supported me and raised me so well, in the first 18 years of my life. Then he was taken away from me, and now it's my turn to do everything I can for him. And I just, I'm frustrated and saddened that he's still there, and it's been so long. I certainly would have thought he'd be out by now. And, of course, you think about all the efforts you've put in, and, still see no result, of course, is frustrating and can be, almost debilitating, on certain days. But you just have to remember that if you don't do anything, nothing's going to happen. I think that's abundantly clear. So, yeah.
Well, your resilience is amazing. Stay strong and keep up the great work. What should the Chinese government be doing better? Now, I asked Peter Humphrey the same question, and I said, yes, it might fall on deaf ears, but it's worth stating in case someone is listening, someone who can do something about this is listening.
Yeah, it's a good question, of course. Well, the short answer is, of course, they can release my dad and the other Americans wrongfully detained. But, to expand on that a bit, I think the Chinese government in recent weeks, especially, they've said a lot about, wanting to, to cooperate and talk with the United States. And I know that, they've, opened the channels of communication, with the United States on a wide range of issues. Of course, Secretary Blinken is scheduled to visit China in the coming weeks. And, that's terrific. But, I would just want to remind the Chinese government that, while you're arbitrarily detaining innocent, ordinary Americans for political leverage, how can the United States cooperate in good faith? And yeah, you might think that we're three people, so the United States is not going to pay attention. But, just look at how much attention this issue of Americans being wrongfully held has gotten, all the way up to the president himself. And, that was spurred by, just look at the, recent actions and that the president himself has taken to release, to win the release of so many Americans wrongfully detained around the world. So the United States government is certainly paying attention. And, it's a very easy thing to the Chinese government. I know there's lots of very challenging bilateral issues that are not going to be resolved anytime soon. But this doesn't have to be one of them. You can just, put my dad on a plane, and then, this is one easy thing that you can just knock out. So, if you're in the Chinese government and you're listening to this, just remember, we're innocent Americans that, that this happened to. And, my dad, still loves his home country of China. But, having been subjected to this, it's difficult to see, why he's being treated like this, other than because he's now an American citizen and being used as part of these larger political dynamics that, ordinary families like us should really have no part in.
What should the U.S. government be doing better?
Yeah, so I've been asking, for the U.S. government, and specifically President Biden, to negotiate for my dad's release, along with the release of David Lin and Mark Swadan, with at least the same intensity that he has, with the Brittany Griner case, because, we saw that was very successful. Of course, she's a very high profile celebrity figure. She had just so much and a huge outpouring of support. And that undoubtedly, of course, put more pressure on the administration to act. And now, to be 100% clear, nobody in our family or any of the other hostage families is upset that Brittany came home, and any attempts by the journalists or anybody else to spin it that way are completely disingenuous, right? We're all happy to see any wrongfully detained American come home because, these are Americans that by definition are being held for political reasons, and so they should not be there, and they're suffering needlessly. So they should all come home. And we just ask the president to remember that there are just so many other cases, especially in China, where unfortunately his administration has not been successful yet, at least for the wrongful detainees. And we reiterate our request, President Biden, to meet with you. You've already met with several families, including the Griner, Reed, Whelan, and Tice families. Our families in China deserve that same recognition, especially if our loved one's release is indeed a personal priority, as you have said in statements. I mean, we need to see actions back those words up. We've heard so many words. We've heard thousands of times, literally, that my dad's release is the highest priority of our government and that they're doing everything they can. But we just haven't seen that in the action. I mean, it just we see how long it takes just for our government to even do one thing, take one step in the direction of negotiating for my dad's release. And that just can't happen. And we understand there's a huge bureaucracy and a lot of factors to consider. But we've seen that when push comes to shove in these other countries, when decisions need to be made, they can be made very quickly, very expeditiously, and very decisively. And that's it's the job of our president and his administration to protect these Americans who are innocent and being used as pawns by foreign governments. Because if not, then that's sending the message that ordinary Americans are not safe when they travel abroad to a lot of these countries. And I see a lot of criticism online these days that, well, okay, Americans then just shouldn't go to these countries, right? But it's really not so simple. I mean, remember, my dad is every bit of an American citizen as anybody else, but the rest of his family is all in China, right? So of course, he has to go visit. I mean, right? And he should have the right to visit without being arbitrarily detained for political reasons. I mean, that's the burden shouldn't be placed right on the individual to not visit these places that they have very, very good reasons to visit. And, so that's not the solution, right? The solution is to get these Americans out and simultaneously, send a message, put in deterrence efforts to prevent this from happening more. And I think our administration recognizes this duality between getting home the current American prisoners and also deterrence, as provided for in President Biden's recent executive order. We think that's it's a great step, and it is the right framework. But now we just need it to be acted upon. So that we actually get real results and our family can be reunited.
So there were 7 Americans who were wrongfully detained in Venezuela for years, and they were released in October last year. Mark Frerichs, who was held in Afghanistan for 2.5 years, he was released last year. None of their families met President Biden. And yes, I understand. I know that Trevor Reed's family met President Biden, Brittany Griner's family met President Biden, and the vice president as well. Paul Whelan's sister, Elizabeth Whelan, met President Biden too. Austin Tice's family met President Biden as well. But Paul's not home. Austin Tice is not home. Brittany and Trevor are. But my point is, meeting the President of the United States, I agree it's a recognition that all the families of Americans held hostage or wrongfully detained abroad deserve to know and to hear from him that his administration is working to bring your loved ones home. But it doesn't, not meeting the president doesn't mean your loved ones not coming home, as we've seen with the cases of the Venezuelan Americans in Venezuela and Mark Frerichs. So how important is this to you?
Yeah, that's a great observation and a correct question. Look, it's not 100%, right? It's not like, oh, meeting with the president and then, your loved one will come home. And if you don't meet with the president, your loved one won't come home, right? That's not how it works. I mean, I study statistics and, as I would like to, I would like to stay and think, I mean, there's always uncertainty, but the fact of the matter is, if you meet with the president directly, then, he will personally remember, right, this case. And, of course, he's the one at the top who has the authority, right, to make the kinds of decisions that are necessary. Now, as Roger Carstens, the head of the SPIHA office, always says, the other side gets a vote, right? And it's, every situation and the timing of things is, of course, always fluid. So, no, it's not as simple as, oh, you just got to convince the U.S. government to flip a switch, right? And then immediately your loved one will come home. It's, of course, not that simple, right? But the reason meeting with President Biden is important to us is, one, it's very, concrete and completely within the control of the U.S. government, right? It's something the U.S. government can do. They just have to do it. Number two, it's a single action that, we have seen, especially with cases like the Reed case and the Griner case and the Whelan case, it flips a switch for more, more action and much quicker action from our own government, because when it's coming from the top down, it's just going to be faster, right? And that's the reason we ask for it. It's not that once we meet with the president, that's our end goal, right? And then we're done, right? That's not it at all, right? But it's an important first step. And it may not be 100% necessary, right? But from what we see, it's among those things that can be really helpful. And nothing is, we've tried so many things in these last six plus years, and most of them, have probably had, now looking back, we realize they probably, were unfortunately just big wastes of time, right? But that's because, we just don't know, right? And we just try everything that we can and have the energy to push for. But so, when you have something like meeting with the president where there's, documented evidence that it makes something better, and then that's a pretty good proposition to ask for, because there are very few things like that in this enterprise, if there's anything that we've learned.
I absolutely agree with you. From a campaigning perspective, meeting the president of the United States face to face shows that in terms of your advocacy, you've gone as high as you can. And that's all pretty much you can do, apart from lobbying China, trying to convince China to change their behavior, which is going to be a lot more difficult. So I agree with you. Meeting from a campaigning perspective, from your perspective, what you can do is go to the highest levels of government and get that commitment from President face to face that he's going to do everything he can to bring your loved one home. I've noticed that you've been able to get a bit more media attention on your father's case, but most of this coverage only takes place when another American was recently freed from captivity. So what can journalists and the news media do to help?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, to your point about, this coverage coming, on the heels of other Americans being released and things like that. I mean, look, that's why, I joined the steering committee for the Bring Our Families Home campaign, because, I realized that, hey, like, when we're all together and pooling our resources and experiences, then, we can be a lot louder than just one family can be. And so that's, I think that's the reason why that's happened. And, we've seen that, I think the success is largely of raising awareness of these cases, including my dad's case, just comes from us, coming together and making more noise, which also has, of course, we've been told by very senior government officials that has directly helped, a lot of those releases that did occur. In terms of journalists, what they can do, for a start, they can make sure everyone at the top of our government is even aware of my dad's name. What they can do is, at every White House press briefing on China, they go ask, hey, what's the latest on Kai Li, right, and the other Americans wrongfully detained in China. We saw that, there was a brave journalist that did that the day after Brittany Griner came home asking about Ahmad Shargi in Iran. That journalist asked the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, and she clearly did not even know who Ahmad Shargi was. And that's, from our perspective, one of the highest profile U.S. cases of hostage diplomacy. But she didn't even know that name. I mean, it seemed like she only knew Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan. So, and so that in response, this week, the Bring Our Families Home campaign released a video, introducing to her and all the other administration officials, the 15 families in her campaign. And so, it's shocking that, after all these years, that's where we're at, but that is where we're at. So, of course, the people at the top are constantly changing. Every time that happens, we just need the journalists to just, make this, recurring issue so that they know that they will be asked this, and knowing that they will be asked this, they have to prepare, and hopefully that spurs some more action that they can point to. Because if every single time they're asked about Kai Li and they don't have an answer, then that in itself will become a story and a negative point for the administration, whoever's in charge, whether that's the current administration or another administration. I mean, that's just how our government operates, because these officials are all elected by the people.
What can the public do to help bring your father home?
So I think certainly, again, please support the Bring Our Families Home campaign in any way, whether that's retweeting our posts, sharing our social media, pitching stories, donating so that we have the budget to put on demonstrations and advertising to get the word out and encourage our government to take action. I think that's, at this time, perhaps the most direct way to help. And of course, if to anyone and everyone, find a way to pitch the story of these Americans being held hostage, of course, including my dad. I think that's the way to go. Because we've seen that when our government does get the spotlight shined on them, then they will have to react. I mean, that's just how it works. It's not specific to this administration only, but it's just how it is.
So if I'm a member of the public and I want to know a lot more about your father's case, do I still go to freekaili.org?
Yeah, freekaili.org has info. Probably the most up to date would be to follow Free Kai Li on Twitter. So I post there regularly. I think that's the best way to get the most up-to-date information.
Harrison, I've said this before and I'll say it again. We'll be right here campaigning by your side until your father is back home with you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thank you, Darren, and appreciate you having me back on.
Thank you for listening to Pod Hostage Diplomacy. Thank you for giving your time and for showing these families that they're not alone, that there are good, caring people out there willing to stand by their side and help in any way possible.
Because if enough people care, then the right people will care enough. This is a basic rule of thumb that is true for all campaigning.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to our fortnightly newsletter called The Hostage Briefing. It's the best way to keep up to date with the cases we're working on, as well as new episodes. You can subscribe to this newsletter using the link in the description of this podcast episode that you're currently listening to. Thanks again, and take care.